Hello, everyone. This is Andrea Hiott. Thank you for listening to Love and Philosophy. As you know, I made a promise to just do these intros improv wherever I am, off the cuff, off the heart. So, for those of you who are here for the first time, that's why this might sound a little in the moment, because it is, because I want to speak with heart. Today I'm talking with Keya Maitra, and we're going to talk about the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very important text in Hinduism, and we'll tell you all about it in just a little bit. Probably some of you already know how I'm trying to constellate, think of a constellatory approach to what we've thought of as a dualism. And I know that's some kind of big words, but just if you think of things like either or, like mind, body, we often think of things through those contrasts of either or. And a lot of this show is trying to think of how do we let those be, not try to dissolve them into each other, but then see what else they constellate with. Like what other kind of constellations are part of that either or. In this conversation, really, we get into that in a very beautiful way. I think the conversation itself becomes a way of doing that. And we also talk about the power of conversation and what conversation is and how it is a kind of portal. And this relates a lot to the Gita because it is a conversation. The text itself is a conversation, but also in the way that Keya translates it and discusses it in her book. And it's very funny because I sort of fumble a little bit at the start, and I call her book a philosophical commentary, because that's what you usually call these sort of translations, where you then have a little part where you discuss something. But as she corrects me, it's definitely not a commentary. It's what she calls a corner, a philosophical corner. And that little fumble actually is wonderful because it opens us into talking about what really matters here. Why is it, what's so philosophical about this text, and how can we think of texts in ways that still relate to us? I mean, this text has been going and going and going. There obviously is a reason, so why? And what does it really mean about how we think about who we are in the world? There's this thing called, what do we talk about? Oh, the action without attachment. That's an important little phrase that comes from the Gita, or that people sort of think about. It's of how do you act without being attached? And if you've ever felt really attached to something, you know how much pain comes in that, wanting a certain outcome, for example, or loving someone very much and then having to go through some sort of loss. So what we get to here is that you're not getting away from the feeling and the care and the love, but what happens is that you can act in a way that actually feels expansive. So it's not about cutting yourself off when you have action from attachment, without attachment. Action without attachment is actually about realizing that what you are is beyond what you had thought, that you're more expansive. At least this conversation and trying to read through the Gita, especially, I've been going through a lot. I'll tell you about it some other time, but what's been really helpful for me is thinking of how what I see in the world and the people around me are part of something that I'm also part of. That when you let go of your attachment to what you think you are and yourself, you feel more of what this wider, bigger, moving, amazing, some would say spiritual, you could also think of it as philosophical, you can think of it however comes naturally for you, but this bigger movement that we are literally in and as and part of. What I might think of as waymaking in a way, this movement that you can't really describe, but that we are all part of. So a lot of what we discuss here is about rethinking our connection to that more powerful, but also a part of us, ecological world or multiplicity, or whatever you might want to think of as this kind of force, and how we can become more specific in a way. We talk a lot about how in her translation she kept a lot of these very specific names, because a lot of being able to connect to that expansive nature that is ours is also about being more precise and more specific in each moment, because there's always a truth in each moment, but that truth changes as we change. That's another theme that comes up a lot on the show, how to be more specific, but also to be able to be more expansive. So I know this is getting a little bit abstract. That's the danger of me just talking as I'm on the road here, about to go to the airport. But this is what comes up, this conversational aspect, how messy and nested and kaleidoscopic our relationships are to ourselves and to one another, but how that's the beauty of it. And it's like a ladder that goes in all directions, and we can explore ourselves and our connections to each other and this deep love that is conversation. If you really think about what conversation is, it's one reason this is love and philosophy. It's a kind of care. If you really care about something and you're trying to explore it together, you're trying to learn, you're listening. Listening is a very big part of it. And as you do that, you move beyond that either or. And I think that Keya really expresses this in her philosophical work around consciousness, around the Gita, in this book that we talk about here. And that's one reason I wanted to have her on. Also, you can tell she really cares about people and about her students and about these ideas and about being a philosopher. And she's also a wonderful person because she started in analytic philosophy. Hilary Putnam, I think she wrote her thesis on, who's a wonderful philosopher. I'll have to tell you about another time. But I love her work because it doesn't stay in the usual bounds, and but at the same time it respects those, and it's very rigorous. So I hope you'll check out her work. I'm going to put some in the show notes if you haven't heard of her. But also, I just hope you enjoy this conversation and that it helps you connect to what is more expansive around you that also is you, and that helps you to care more about yourself and to realize that you're not just in your head, that you are part of an ongoing, co-creating, embodied, beautiful world. And it can be very painful and very hard. And that's why we need to have conversations and help one another. Have conversations that help us to better understand this powerful, sometimes very difficult flow world that we are part of. So wherever you are today, if you love someone, think of it, feel it, let it be. Let yourself expand with that. Maybe tell them or show them or just look at them with that love in your heart. It makes a big difference in the world. If anything, it's the reason we're here. We just don't understand it yet. Because the more we can do that, the more potential's open in the world. And everybody has it, no matter what, no matter who you are, no matter how you're defining yourself. You have this power just by being alive, by being a body. Okay, I send you lots of love today, and good feelings and strength to get through whatever you might be going through. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Well, hello, Keya. It's so great to have you on Love and Philosophy today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andrea. It's beautiful, and I'm so happy to be here and honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Today we're going to talk about the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, a contemporary introduction, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2018. And it's a translation with philosophical commentary. So many connections that could come out of that. But I thought just to start, I would really love to think about this work and also think about you growing up and how you came into writing dissertations on philosophy in different countries and what this particular work actually meant to you during that time as you were discovering yourself or discovering philosophy.
Yeah, so thank you. One thing I do want to say, it's not a philosophical commentary.
Oh, okay.
But,
Thank you.
I call it Philosopher's Corner.
Yeah.
In fact,
Each
the
time
reason,
at the end. Yeah.
right, the reason that I'm saying it is not philosophical commentary, because actually Gita has been commented on, extensive commentaries by, starting with at least in the medieval period in India. So that's why I'm not doing that kind of Gita scholarship. So, but getting to your question about growing up and all, yeah, it's Gita came to me. Of course, I grew up in a Hindu household. My mom sort of did not know Sanskrit. We are in a Bengali-speaking household. My mom didn't know Sanskrit, but that didn't mean she didn't memorize, the Gita in Sanskrit. And she would read some verses in the morning and all. My first encounter with the Gita was in my middle school. in my Sanskrit class, we read some parts, chapter 11, actually, you know, excuse me, for translation. But honestly, doing philosophy in India, I did not encounter it at all in a philosophy classroom. And that meant, I mean, that includes undergraduate, master's, MPhil, PhD, all through. And then I kind of I mean, I knew the Gita existed. I knew, I mean, I have heard it sung and recited and all that. I read some of it, but really, honestly, academically in the classroom is when I was doing my second PhD in Connecticut, and I was as a grad student was asked to teach a class for Joel Kupperman, Introduction to Comparative Philosophy, and he did the Gita, and I was of course using his syllabus, and I said, "So you do Gita?" And Joel goes, "Yes, of course." And that was my sort of in philosophical encounter with the text. And then, of course, I have done, lot. So it has been a kind of a, I don't know, it is a, whether I want to call it a love story, I do want to call it a story of discovery, story of incredible sort of mine. The every time I go read it, I find something. So I don't agree with everything in there and all. Um, Other thing you asked about, so in India, then what was I doing, right? I wasn't doing the Gita. Um, Doing very much, even in my master's, I was introduced to analytic philosophy, Western analytic philosophy. I had a professor who had just gone back after spending, I believe, a year in Boston, and studied of history of analytic philosophy, Western analytic philosophy. I went on to write a PhD on Hilary Putnam. So philosophy of language, very much so. Um, so in a way, I loved philosophy. I mean, the love for philosophy was always there. And I think I'm a slow learner. So for me, what it what philosophy means and what it means for me, right? That's why I'm so intrigued, and also I love your angle to philosophy, love and philosophy. So for me, I think now I would say, I came across this way of putting by a feminist philosopher, Naomi Sheeman, and she wrote about her writing, right? Philosophy as being one's whole self in writing. And I feel like my journey with philosophy is coming to being my whole self with philosophy. And so I loved philosophy of language. I've done philosophy of mind. I've done, other things. Now I also am trying to do virtue epistemology. But it's, I think, more and more. And Gita has somehow anchored this journey for me, knowingly and unknowingly. This coming to being my whole self. So maybe I spoke too much. So I'll
No, that's beautiful. You can just keep going if you want, because I love all of that, and there's so much richness in there. Maybe what's coming up a little bit is that we should maybe tell people what the Gita is for those who don't. And I don't know, maybe way to do that is to think about what's different about what you're doing with it. Because I like that you corrected me with the commentary, because I was just sort of, I'm a little flustered, and I was just sort of basically saying what's on the notes there. And actually, that's a really important point, actually, of your book, of the way that it's translated, and that you do have a corner that's well, I will let you do it, but maybe we could say a little bit about what this text is, and then maybe why you wanted to do a different sort of translation, because this is a very different sort of translation in my very limited experience.
Yeah. So, of course, yes. What? That's a very good question. So it's a conversation. It's written in Sanskrit. When the Gita was composed, it's part of one of the Sanskrit epics, Mahabharata. It happens in chapter 6 of Mahabharata, and it's a very dramatic kind of setting because the storyline is that, two sets of cousins, they're trying to really figure out who has kind of uh, um, right to the kingdom, and anyway, they couldn't figure it out, especially for one side. So they are, getting ready for war, right? Two sides have now, or the Kurukshetra. So that's the place of the war that is going to happen. And then Krishna, of course, he's serving as a charioteer of Arjuna, who is one of the major fighters. They're all Kshatriyas, but he's a renowned archer, right? Among other things. So Krishna has agreed to be Arjuna's charioteer. So in the Gita, we don't get all of that in the Gita. As the Gita starts, so the characters that we hear from in the Gita are interestingly, there is a guy called Sanjaya who is narrating, right? So there is, of course, a writer who is Vyasa, but then in the Gita, we don't hear the author, of course, but then we hear Sanjay who is narrating to because one of the kings, the main king who was in the throne at the time, his name is Dhritarashtra. He's blind, so he cannot see. So Sanjay has been given this sort of divine eyes. He can see anything that happens. So he is narrating. And then he is narrating this conversation between Krishna and Arjuna, right? Krishna starts out and ends up being a human being. He's the charioteer. But of course, in the course of the Gita, it is revealed that, of course, he is, the supreme God. He is reality, basically. And then Arjuna, first he says at the end of first chapter, so Gita is a 18 chapter long conversation, 700 verses. It's kind of interesting that everybody stood still until these guys kind of worked it out for 700.
Yeah.
But that's, so sometimes Indologists, at least the folks I have read, have argued that, like as a epic, the storyline was circulating in various parts of India before it got, we get and then we have various versions before we get a kind of a critical edition. And then one of the arguments is that it used to be a very Kshatriya story, right? It's warfare and all. There is, of course, ethics in it, right and wrong and all, but it's about, then this is also, Gita is a kind of a insertion of the Brahmanans, it's about thinking and contemplation and why, questions of why we should do what we do and all that. Anyway, so that sort of is the Gita. That gives you some idea to your audience. Gita, at least, this is a sort of a separate point, but I'm just starting a project on what we teach in Indian philosophy. Like, what does Indian philosophy curriculum typically include? And there I am I'm having all kinds of interesting ideas how that itself has evolved and why something has come in and gone out and all that. But why my translation, right? Definitely. And you'll see if anybody reads my introduction. Actually, I open with that question because I think it's a very important question. Gita has been translated hundreds, maybe thousands of times in all languages. Of course, my mom read it in Bangla. It was translated in all Indian languages, but also European languages, and not only other languages in English. Every year, if you look at it, there are like 2 or 3 or 4 new English translation of the Gita is released. So why my translation? So it's really, I think I had a very modest aim, and I still have a very modest goal, was that I was teaching the Gita in the classroom, in Western classroom. I was in America teaching. And actually, as I told you, Joel Kupperman's class, I mean, that syllabus was the first time, and Joel did Barbara Stoller Miller's translation of the Gita. And I use that, it's in poetic form. It's beautiful and it's accessible. Students loved it, it has some of the drama. But I, having grown up in India and also in a context, right, I knew more of the storyline and I wanted more from the Gita. So, but then there are other translations that are translations plus commentaries that are more involved than what I would like. So that was actually, honestly speaking, my um, goal, to translate the Gita in a way for it to work in philosophy classroom. That's why, the philosopher's corner is after every chapter. So some of the things that I'm doing, maybe one thing I can point out right away is Barbara Stoller Miller, for example. So Krishna uses all kinds of different names for Arjuna, and Arjuna also uses different names for Krishna. And as well, Sanjaya actually will also use different names. But Barbara Stoller Miller says, oh, yeah, they are all different names, they have different meanings, but it doesn't matter to us. And for me, it does matter because, whether you decide to call somebody something in a particular context than other, I think I want to at least give the reader a sense of that kind of a relationality, right? Often, also honestly speaking, I could also say, Andrea, the fact that Arjuna is often referred to as the son of Kunti, and that's referring to his mother, and it made it, it was important for me that relationality is being addressed. So I have kept all the names, those kinds of things. And then the philosopher's corner is where I wanted to bring out, especially for the Western classroom, for cross-cultural purposes, some of the, those who are not steeped in, say, Indian philosophy. They have not studied Indian philosophy for, years and years and all. So how is Gita still philosophically relevant? And I do think it is very philosophically relevant. And that doesn't mean that I think it is everything in it has to be agreed with or not to be critically engaged with, but that philosophically, it's a text that has a lot of potential for philosophical engagement. So,
Yes, wonderful. I love how it feels conversational. I don't know if you'll agree with that. And I wonder if that's how you teach too, if you like a lot of dialogue and discussion. And I also thought, or I think that it fits with the text itself, even in the way you described it, and that situationality, even the example you gave of the names. I mean, in a way, that's a kind of conversation with time and the past that we're respecting, and that becomes part of the book.
yes.
I can see how the translator might think that's not important or something, no one will get it. But I think part of it is actually getting how important that is, right? So I wonder about that conversational. It's almost like a nested conversational aspect that you continued with your translation. Does that make sense to you? And do you teach in that way
Yeah.
too? Or
Yeah, that's beautiful, Andrea. I must say, um, I think when I'm successful, it's that never losing that sense of conversation, right? And philosophy, I mean, the role of conversation in philosophy is not just, you don't have to, I mean, Plato and, those dialogues. So,
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
yeah. And
It's
here
a beautiful
also,
blend with philosophy of what
yes.
we're trying to do with the Western tradition. And, that conversational aspect is a very natural place. So it's very beautiful that you would pick up on that, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say I'm so thankful that Joel had given me that opportunity to teach, and then actually publishing my own translation. I would say it seemed like an audacity when my mom was alive at that time, and I had told her that, oh, I think I'm going to publish it, and she was horrified because you see, for her this was a very religious text. It's a and I'm not very religious, so she was like, how can you translate something? It's not just some kind of
Mm.
philosophy, right? So anyway,
Wow, that fits very well with these themes for me because as you were talking, I was also thinking about your mom a lot and the mom and the mother part of it all, because this can seem very masculine, but it's really not. And I was thinking of you as a child listening to it, and that if that was a kind of conversational experience in a different way, almost in a more situated sort of way, a bodily way, I would even
yeah.
imagine you said that it's affected you in ways you don't even realize or you're only starting to realize, and I'm wondering if growing up with it and it obviously being so important to your mom, if that's another sort of conversational aspect that's been part of all this for you.
Yes, yes, I think there's all these various, I agree with you, various layers. And, almost sometimes the people say about you turn every corner and you seem to know something or something comes to you. It feels that way, this text. I think it was very important, of course, to my mom. Uh, but so even, the serendipity of it for me translating was because, Daniel Kolak, he used to run he had, for Wordsworth philosopher series for various different. So he had, so I was doing something on Putnam for him, and he said, so he learned that I read Sanskrit and, but I'm also a philosopher. And he's like, you have to translate the Gita. And I said, no. And he said, why not? Because uh, I mean, it's true, Gita has been translated many times, but for Westerner, for philosophy classroom, why don't you? Yes, 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 please do it. So that's how I started doing it. So I think that is how I have kept it, kept my focus because, folks who have translated over the years, hundreds of years. They are, I mean, in no way I can even measure to them in terms of Gita scholarship. But for me, it is an amazing text. And uh, so, how do I teach it? Right. So I think it is actually the conversation. Of course, it is a conversation, but it is also actually, it's true. Krishna talks most of the time. I mean, Arjuna talks all of the first chapter, but other than that, Krishna talks most of the time. However, but that's true in some ways of Plato's dialogues as well, right? However, though, what I have seen in the Gita is that there are some moments where Arjuna will ask a very potent question, right? So you have that kind of, it's not already you know where it's going, right? There is a real converse, because you see in the conversational element, there is a kind of a flexibility, a kind of a receptivity, right? It's an openness, right? Where it goes. And I think that this text, it, Thoreau, apparently, when he had gone to Walden Pond, he had taken only very few books. And Gita, one translation of Gita was one of them. So, I mean, you know, uh, uh, David Thoreau, right? So this is a book that has spoken to a lot of people from all walks of life, not just philosophers. So what is it? I think it is one is it's different people can see themselves in the book and kind of become a part of that conversation, I think. Yeah, so the conversational element that you point out is essential of this text.
It is, and also I guess that gets into dialectics, and we can, there's a whole lot of ways we could think about how that opens worlds. But I think it's very interesting, especially in this book, because of the way, these are like two parts, and we often think of it as a dualism. It's kind of mirrored in a way, but this is a very different sort of dualism. And we can get into that in a minute. But first, I'd also just want to comment, as you were talking, I was thinking of how even the way you tell the story of coming into translating this, and a lot of the way you came into philosophy reminds me of sort of the feeling I get reading the book of learning how to action without attachment, openness, even the way you're kind of saying, no, I can't do that. Or, and the people in your life, maybe you wouldn't have expected that you would do that. Or there's a lot of similar themes. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I just wanted to kind of comment that it feels serendipity. You said serendipity, and that feels like part of it somehow. But also just thinking about why don't we think about the action without attachment? That seems to relate a bit here and can lead us into that dualism thing. Is that the main kind of theme that you've seen most people remember or pick up on in the Western world from this?
Yeah,
Or
I
any world, I
think
guess.
any world actually. I think even action. So one of the things in Indian philosophy, of course, if Gita is very much situated in that. So if action brings you, right, karma produces all this residue that you have to be reborn, right? So why? One argument could be that I should stop acting, right? Then I'm not producing any more residual stuff for which I have to be reborn. Gita actually is very clearly not impressed by that argument because I mean, of course, Krishna is asking Arjuna to take part in this war, right? I mean, not to go into the forest or something. So then, of course, you're acting, and there's early on, Arjuna actually tells Krishna that you are telling me all of these things about the self is real, the body is not real, blah blah blah, and then you're asking me to do this violent act because of course you see because these were two sets of cousins. So Arjuna goes there to the battleground and sees that his cousins, his teachers, his because they grew up basically in the same court, right, in a royal court. So he's like, these are people I should be worshiping. How can I, taking up a weapon against them and possibly even kill them and fight against them, right? So, I mean, it's a very compelling argument that Arjuna has, Um, and
Yeah, very intimate, and I think we all feel that in different ways.
right, right.
Not about
And
maybe exactly this sort of situation, but feeling like we have to do something that doesn't feel right or something.
right, exactly. It's a kind of a moral dilemma, right? So so in response to that, you see, the Krishna says, of course you have to act, and there's a huge ontology that he develops and everything. Why you have to act? Because the nature of the body is such that whether you like it or not, you will act, and so on and so forth. However, where you do have, so you don't really have much control there because you have a body, the body acts and blah blah blah. However, where you do have some control over is what is the attitude with which you act, right? And do you act with being attached to the fruits of action, right? Karma fall, that's what it's being used here. So results. So if you can act without being um, devoted or without being consumed by a particular result, right? So acting without attachment here, with attachment here is attached So action without attachment is attachment to the results of action, fruits of action, outcome, versus acting purely for the sake that it is act. You need to act. Of course, I have I've published some stuff a while ago where people often think this is somewhat like Immanuel Kant, the deontology, right? Action for action's sake, not no. And I think actually, yes, there is something, but that's missing the point. Because Krishna is saying, yes, doing your action in a kind of but not by um, abstracting away all your relationships, but holding on your relationships, but seeing that actually if I can act without uh, particular result or not, without being, consumed by or being absolutely focused on, right? And that's why I think actually that's where I think the whole yoga that he's talking about, right? That you have to cultivate yoga, that he says to Arjuna, and that the yoga is a kind of a redirection of attention. That's what I think. So maybe I will stop there. I don't know whether
Oh,
I'm
there's
answering
so
your
much.
question.
Oh, it's so exciting to me because I mean, I really want to talk about yoga and attention and that, but this also makes me think of why the conversational aspect is so important again, because and the relations in the way you were saying, the names and everything, because we can't just, it's not abstract, as you said. We can't just, it's not that we're just letting it go. It's so intimate and it's so bodily and it's so unavoidable that we're learning to hold the tension. So I think you talk about it some in the book, and I'm having to stop myself from going into all that because we'll lose time. But really, here's a generalization. We often think, oh, we just go with the flow, or something with the Tao, maybe with Chinese, or you're just and there's a sense where, like you're saying, or even relating that to deontology or something, there's something to that. But in this, and I feel like maybe this is part of why it's so hanging around so long and affecting us so much, because of the conversational aspect. It's too messy. We understand that it's always a tension. There's always another way to look at it. And there's always some other connection that's gonna come in, and you can't really get away from it. So it becomes much more something else, which I'm not quite sure how to handle. But I think the way yoga is used is doing it right, with the way that the conversation itself is becoming how we can hold this and transform. Does that make any sense at all to you? Okay. And I
Definitely.
guess, yeah, you can just comment on that, but also I want to look at that word yoga. Also karma, because these words are so popular in a way now that I feel like we don't actually get that tension in them, but I get it in reading what you're writing. So I guess I'm just laying that out there to see, am I understanding that right? And the way you even don't, the way the translations of the words, or no translations of the words, I feel the tension in that a bit too. And I wonder if you felt it, and if these words are as important as I'm, so excitedly proclaiming right now.
Yeah, so much. This is lovely. I think I want to say this so much you said, Andrea. Two things I do want to mention. One is, letting go and tension. And I would say that actually Gita also, often people will say, oh, Gita tells you to let go. Yes, but I think letting go, so in that way, it is like a Taoist text. And of course, I'm not commenting on Taoism here, but I think for Gita, let go, but what is it that you are letting go is also very important. One could argue that that's even more important. And, this is a side comment. In my most recent work, I'm really working a lot on equanimity, samattam, that the Gita talks about. And I just think that's such an important concept. And anyway, so I think samattam is letting go, but not letting go such that you don't. care. You care a lot, but without simply caring about the particular selfish outcomes, right? Um, so that's, I wanted to say that. So yes, letting go, people would say, well, Gita does, yes, of course, but it's the, what is it that you are letting go and how? I think the point of Gita, I think, is the beauty of it is also focus on how you do it, right? There also, and then I do want to say the tension that you mentioned. It was beautiful, Andrea, and I think actually, of course, the setting itself is that of, huge tension, right? For Arjuna, he's a fighter. He's a renowned fighter. For him to say, "No, I'm not going to fight," so the tension, and I think, and actually, Mahatma Gandhi, of course, did his own translation, read the Gita every morning, and actually he talked about the Gita as one's mother. So eternal mother was how he referred to the Gita, and then he also said in other places that the Gita is like the Hindu Bible. In Hinduism, you don't have one text, right? You have many texts, and Gita is one of them. But he said it is sort of like so, approachable when a Hindu, practicing Hindu, is concerned about, just mired in moral dilemma, what should I be doing? Then they can go to the Gita. And maybe the way he thought that maybe a practicing Christian goes to the Bible, that Gita could help. So, in a way, Gita's that kind of potency, because I think it is a relatable conversation. So I think your conversational idea, but it's also and conversation itself has a kind of a tension in it, right? And here, I think sometimes tension always means negative, and I think tension actually could also mean a potency, right? A possibility, right? Um, yeah. So
Yeah, I think
I
about that a lot. No, go ahead.
no, I was going to actually say maybe you will hear. I want to hear what you think, and then I'm going to go talk about yoga. I know you had asked me to talk
I was
about.
going to go to yoga too, but I was also going to say exactly that's what I meant when I said tension with a T, because we will talk about attention too, and sometimes those sound similar. But yes, I often think of caring as, and I know that's something that you bring out a lot, as a sort of tension. It's and not in a bad way. It's getting away from thinking of things only in good or bad way. That we are connected is hard. That I love my people around me, my family, everyone. It's not easy, and yet it's wonderful, right? So it's
Yes,
kind of, I think about that a lot, and we talk about that a lot on the show of how to hold that stuff, hold the paradox, but it doesn't mean dissolving. And
yes,
I think
yes,
that's a confusion that happens a lot, but that I feel is really exciting about this text and your work around it and with it. In terms of the dualism and dichotomy that I brought up, but also in the way the yoga is so important. And I'm still trying to figure out how to articulate this, but I think it has to do for me in the way that it's helped me so far already is thinking in the way that it's presented. The yoga is sort of the way that we're, I don't know how to say this, holding the tension such that we recognize ourselves in Krishna or
yes,
in what is around us. And this is the
yes,
way that we then can do the action while still caring. And
yes,
for me, that's a huge revelation. I don't know how to quite articulate it, but it's so different from all of that just being about me letting go. And I think that has to do with the yoga, but also with this very different idea of what we would call dualism. But it's,
yes.
yeah. So that's a lot, but just take it anywhere you want.
Yes, because the text has so much, So I think quick, maybe I could possibly, I'm hoping, say a little bit about all of your point. So the yoga is very important. Yoga is mentioned in the, throughout the 700 long verses, maybe more than 150 times. And one of the reasons I kept it yoga and not translated, say, like Barbara Stoller Miller, she translates it as discipline. Yoga gets translated in few other ways, but discipline is typically people do. I didn't, because actually yoga, because you see, if you translate it as discipline, then there's a popular meaning of yoga right now about, sort of physical exercises, bodily, exercises, stretches, has mental has, of course, because some yoga studios also includes, some pranayama or some, settling contemplation, meditation or something. But for Krishna, actually, when Krishna, in many places, talking about the yoga, be an yogi, right? He keeps telling that to Arjuna. Arjuna, be an yogi. Once you are an yogi, you will not be so bothered by this. So when he is saying to Krishna, Arjuna, he's not just saying to Arjuna that, learn to stretch, because Arjuna is in very good shape. I think that's at least the senses. So I was being flippant there, but I think it's important to point out, right? There's. But I think the point, so what Krishna has in mind is where yoga is a kind of a union in which, yes, ultimate union, where I love your way of saying holding together. So the tension itself is not, yes, at the end, end of chapter 18 in the Gita, Arjuna says, oh, my because it starts with Arjuna Visada Yoga. I done Arjuna's dilemma, or so all my doubts have been answered. I'm ready to fight. So in a way there is a resolution, but the resolution is not by denying the question, right? It's an understanding of them, right? So it's a not necessarily a pure transcendent, you know, but a kind, so the holding it together, but also seeing it from a clear perspective, seeing your relationship with the Gita, with Krishna and all. So yoga in that sense of union, right? And actually, in many verses, you can see there's a almost like a two level of union happens. The maybe you can say acknowledgement or awareness of union. There is an awareness, and then there is a comprehension, right? Those are different things. So the one union, of course, is that that really the body, the self is in me, and the body thinks I have certain things that are uh, mutable, that will actually die, but then there are things in me that are also mm, undying, eternal parts of it. So that's one union, right? That kind of putting it. But then the union that same self is in Krishna and in everything else, right? So so the union actually has works at very multi level kind of a concept, right? So yoga then here is a not just a physical exercise. Yes, physical exercise can possibly help you understand some kind of union, but then you do need some philosophical, right, clarification. So the dualism then, right? It brings me to the dualism. So, beautiful verse in chapter 2, people usually often say, so Arjuna has just said, of course, that Krishna, I'm not just going to fight because this is just horrendous. Yes, those people are wanting to fight, our enemies, but they are, if I also give in and fight, then how am I different, right? The result is not going to be good. So then one of the things early on Krishna says in chapter 2, Krishna says, okay, you sound like a wise person, but then you are grieving for those that should not be grieved for, right? Because look, we all have our bodies, we change, right? We were children, we put on different clothes, So, and in this system, of course, you also believe in rebirth, right? So, of course, when the self has, ended, one life, one body ends, you become somebody else. Why is that? That's not so worrisome. Um, there is actually something in you, in me, in all of us that cannot be touched by any weapon, right? So this idea that actually, of course, I'm not suggesting that this argument is a foolproof argument, because and I think there is some, because folks, my students often will say, but still, what about, he doesn't respond to Arjuna's worry about, not teaching, not killing his revered teacher, right? So not just not killing anybody, but killing a particular person. And so there are some arguments that people will make. And I think Krishna doesn't do such a good job, or maybe doesn't think he needs to, whatever. Um, but the argument there is that, look, why are you so worried about killing? Because honestly speaking, if you think killing is an end of somebody's existence, then all of these people go on to exist, right? It's true, you will kill their body, but at one point in chapter 11, Krishna will say, and guess what? They have all been killed by me. And I think, what does he mean by, so he says, be my instrument, basically. And what does it mean? A lot of folks have actually said a lot of things about that. I think maybe they are killed by their own action, right? Because the karma that they have created, these folks, and the decisions they have made and how they have made, this is the accumulated effect that they will have to face. So it's an interesting, so the dualism then is usually in the Western philosophy, of course, Western philosophy of mind, philosophy, from Descartes, not so much in Aristotle or Plato, but definitely from Descartes. I think people, of course, Descartes scholars might disagree with me, but usually this mind-body dualism, right? Mind is one thing, body is another thing, or mind-physical dualism. Very interesting, but this is also in other Indian philosophical school. But you see that in Gita also clearly. Here, mind, body, everything is in one sort of one category. And then you have the self as the eternal, the undying, whatever, unchangeable. So the dualism you do get, but it's not mind-body dualism. It is self-body dualism, or self-physical or something dualism. But as a result, what you have here is that, you see, for mind-body dualism, if you go that way, then how do you explain a psychophysical interaction, right? That I think of saying X, right, and then I say it, right, physically. So it seems like, there is a very intimate connection between the mind and body, but how is that possible, right? Gita doesn't have that worry, because for Gita, and I think actually, you have mentioned a few times embodied nature, right? Embodied reality. And I think that actually Gita can embrace a kind of embodied cognition, embodied action, embodied even relationality, in a way that I think sometimes, if you go with at least the typical understanding of mind body dualism, you don't, you may not have that conceptual repertoire for doing that.
So yes, so this is the words I can't really pronounce, but you can help me. So it's like Prakriti and Parushka, or
Purusha, yeah,
Parush-
Prakriti and Purusha.
Well, so one of them is what you were saying. It's sort of almost everything that we put into mind and body in a way.
Yes.
I don't know if you would call it nature, or I'm not sure. But and then the other side is this self, as what you said, right? And this seems to be what I was trying to get at with what the yoga helps us sort of feel into, and it's beyond the body, but it also sort of is the body too, isn't it? It's
Yes.
containing it.
Yes.
It's not like I don't feel the sense of separation where there's a cut.
Yeah, so that's where I think, I mean, this is, of course, my reading. And I mean, there are verses, but of course, people often will read their philosophy into it. Um, so, so there's a philosophical school, Sankhya, in Indian philosophy, that talks about this dualism of Prakriti and Purusha. And you're absolutely right, Andrea. Prakriti is often translated as nature. Prakriti, one meaning of that word in Sanskrit word, is nature. But here, nature also not just the beautiful ocean or the tree, right? Nature here means basically everything. Everything in the with Krishna's meaning, it will be everything that changes or that is changeable. So mountains and all. So
Isn't
and
everything that's active? I'm sorry but it's something that count. Like, is it all action?
Yeah.
In a way, okay,
Yes.
because that's very helpful for me if I think of it as all action, in a sense, or because this active, this dynamism is such a part of all of this.
Yes. Yes. All action. And then in Sankhya, that philosophy school, Purusha is the seat of consciousness, and so they are really, even in liberation in Sankhya school, liberation is learning to is a discriminatory knowledge. Here, discriminatory knowledge means to realize our lives happen, ignorance happens because we confuse these two, right?
So it's a kind of discernment. Is that a good
Yes,
word?
discernment.
Or could we even say a sort of, there's a feeling of witness or something, or
Right.
coming into greater capacity to notice, which is leading us toward the attention, I guess. But does that make any sense?
Right. That is in the Gita. So in the and it gets confused because you see the same words are being used. But what I was trying to say is that in the Sankhya system where Prakriti and Purusha are used, they are actually, the dualism remains.
I see.
Even at the end, in the Gita, Krishna does use, that is my Prakriti, the three gunas, Prakriti comes from blah, blah, blah. And then Purusha, he actually identifies himself as the, one of the highest Purusha and all that. But he also actually, there are verses where he says, this is my lower nature, this is my higher nature. So at most of the time, they are consumed under him, right? Yes, they work in that sense. So the idea of witness is very much there, because the Atman, which, in all of us, which remains there, um, is that it's something simply witnesses. It doesn't experience things, right? Uh, or that witnessing here would mean it does experience, but it does experience, I would argue, right? Witnessing would mean that that's where samattam, the equanimity, will come in play, right? What does it mean to be, sukhesu vigatasriya dukhesu nirudvignamana, right? That means in happiness, when you are in success, you are not overjoyed or, out of the world. And in failure, when you are sad and all, you are also not very perturbed by it, right? So it's a kind of a groundedness, right? So I want to argue that the groundedness is not experiencelessness. It is, of course, I am having the experiences, but how I am engaging with the experiences, right? So this witness, which would be the Atman or the self, right, that is the sense in which witness is different from all the action and all. At the end, I mean, Krishna actually says, oh, I don't need to act at all, but I act. But why my act doesn't bind me? Well, because I don't act for particular outcomes, right? So it's also not so much problem with action, but it's the attached way of acting that we typically. So it's not so much at the end he's saying, let's subdue Prakriti, right? If we everything will be hunky dory if we just get rid of Prakriti. I don't know that we can do that, or that at least he thinks about Hindu ideas of evolution and all, but action in itself is not the problem. Action, how we act. And witnessing is important here, is because witnessing allows me to highlight that kind of being same to, remaining kind of unperturbed. Yeah.
That's making me think about how I always sense a sort of multiplicity or kaleidoscopic is a kind of word that I think of, or constellatory. These are words I'm trying to use in my own philosophy. So as you said, I'm reading things in. But I actually do feel that in the text, even though we do have this dichotomy. I wonder if it's kind of creating a suspicious kind of spirit around, like, maybe there isn't a dichotomy, that kind of
Yes.
question.
Yes.
Because even though there's all these contrasts, and as we said, it's not about dissolving the contrast, but learning from them, there seems to be something else that we can't quite talk about, that is maybe there. So, even when we think about why would we want to have good karma, because then we just keep coming back, and isn't the point to transcend? That's complicated, right? Or even thinking about what is happening here, that he's convincing him to go kill people he cares about. That's kind of awful for us, right? To even think about. It's even hard to talk about. And yet, as you read it and stuff, that's not really what it's about. It's about, there's a like, constellating that. So it's not about making a choice, or even about those things, all of us being separate. I don't know if this is making sense to you, but I think it's very hard to talk about. But I wonder if you've sensed into that at all, if you've sensed into a kind of way where this text might be helping us become a little bit, like, nudging us to maybe think beyond some of the categories that seem so important to the text itself.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation, and I think that Gita, that is one of the points of the Gita that I find it to be so, so inspirational in a way. Not religiously, philosophically, actually, because in many places, actually, Krishna says, "Go beyond dualities." Right? Go, of course, doubts. Doesn't doubting people don't do very well in Gita and all, because it is Krishna's message. Krishna has an agenda and all of that. But going back to the dichotomies, so much, it's not necessarily dichotomies, but go beyond dualities, right? Dualities of good and bad. So one might say, actually, that Arjuna's anxiety, Arjuna's initial hesitation, uh, such perplexity, dilemma, is because one kind of a kind of way of really not being able to go beyond that good and evil, right? This, he understood good in this way, understood evil in this way, and then asking Krishna, how are you asking me to do this evil thing, right? And in a way, what I think Krishna does is that, actually, if you understand, so I would say, and as a philosopher, this is self-serving, but I think this is actually the importance of ontology, importance of metaphysics for ethics, for making sense of one's life, right? Metaphysics is not because you do it because you have time. No, no, no. You need to do it because that gives you meaning. That makes your life worth living, right? So here, definitely a way to going beyond dualities, where not necessarily transcending them, but understanding them. You know, uh, at least you may disagree with Krishna's metaphysics, you may disagree with all of that, but that's one of the ways that one could think of this kind of uh, beyond dichotomy. And Krishna actually does say. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's true. And also, I love that you bring up meaning. And I was thinking as you were talking about how Krishna tells Arjuna, okay, your nature will tell you to fight. You're going to get there. And he's basically, but then he's also saying, oh, actually, just reflect on this and do as you choose.
Right.
And so we have this constant paradoxical kind of spirit being raised, right, with the tension that, as you said, that's already around. And thinking about meaning, being able to kind of deal with that differently becomes very meaningful. I was even thinking, you brought up Gandhi, and I know, this was such an important text for him, but also, I'm not sure is it true, but also for the people who killed him, wasn't it also like a very important? And these kinds of things are very hard. I find, like the subject of this book, thinking about like, battle. And these are things people still face. We still face in different ways, maybe not life or death in this kind of context, but I find these really hard and not easy to fit into any two categories in any absolute way, because we can always come at it from a different position. So I think what I'm trying to get at, I mean, even whoever wrote this, the writers of the book and whatever we want to put into that, I mean, as you were saying at the beginning, sometimes we put things into the book we don't even know we're putting into the book. So a lot of people say there's some kind of message or political kind of, whatever. Leaving all that aside, I think reading this book, you can start to feel into that way in which we have to kind of accept that life is really complicated, much more complicated than we were able to deal with. That's why we put it into contrast. But maybe we can start to feel into something else, which kind of goes into the karma and the different lives and everything too, with the constellating and the multiplicity. So, I mean, I'm just kind of rambling on here, but I wonder if that makes sense to you, and if it's been hard for you even to, especially with students. I think about like trying to think about this and, with what I brought up with Gandhi, but also the subject matters and current situations. I mean, have you felt that tension too? Has this been something you've had to kind of think about a little bit?
Yeah, no, I didn't think you were rambling, Andrea. I think this is all. I think of the text. So I'll say a little bit about what me personally. But I think actually this text, more than maybe other people must have other texts, but in a way, the importance of authenticity, right? Importance of um, really resonating Arjuna's dilemma, right? And then Krishna also, it could have been just one point. Krishna says, blah, 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 let's just fight. No, actually, it's this Krishna takes the time to convince him, right? And you are absolutely right. It is convincing because at the end, it's not Krishna, Arjuna doesn't say, oh, I'm going to fight because you say so, but I still have some worries. No, no, no. He's actually saying, oh, my, questions have been answered. I am ready to fight, right? So there's also,
But
of
he still
course,
doesn't win, right?
he actually, yeah, at
Sort
the
of,
end,
kind of.
he,
Or does he? I always wonder.
they win, but so much. I mean, Mahabharata itself is an incredible text because you see that is a text also is a text that is trying to go beyond dichotomies.
Yeah, that's kind
Us-
of what I'm getting at. Even that becomes a bit wider nested complexity.
Yes, very much about that. So that's why I think this authenticity, that understanding that, you know, us that I have worries. This is all of it is me, right? And I that's why for me I really resonate the Gita's idea that everybody is your friend, right? Don't treat friends differently than foes. I mean, these are. I think that's talk about today's world. you know. So I did want to say and. How about my I if I have to be honest with you, Andrea, this text has grown on me. Once again, though, I say it not because I think that I mean, for example, at least there are two verses in chapter 18 talks about, at least the way that I read them, the caste system. It seems like it really sort of, clarifies the caste system. These are the castes. Oh, these should do this because karma theory and the three gunas and all that. And I find it absolutely problematic, and I can see, there's a B.R. Ambedkar was from Dalit community, but he was the director of the, uh, Constitution drafting committee, when India became independent in 1947. Ambedkar was the chairman of the drafting committee. But Ambedkar also was a untouchable, right? I mean, Dalit is the word that we use now. Um, and Ambedkar actually was scathing criticism of the Gita. And I see many of those. So it's not as if that I am enamored with the Gita, but where what I have seen, I I think over time, Gita has less. For me, Gita has become less of somebody else's text. Gita has become more and more, for me, a philosophical text with having I don't know whether I can say it, but I think as any text, philosophical text has its own foibles, has its own blinders, has in my mind. However, though, that doesn't distract from the fact that it can be read in ways that I find very inspiring philosophically. So that sort of is my relation. So, you mentioned about I think it's the Hindu Mahashava person who killed Gandhi. Of course, they're supposed to be big followers of Hinduism. They take actually, there's a holiday for Gita, Gita Day in Indian in Hindu calendar now. But my reading of the Gita and their reading of the Gita is very different, I would say. And I think I take it uh, as a maybe virtue, but as a capacity of this text that it can accommodate, right? All these different readings. Um, and I don't, so that has brought me some consolation, or not consolation, but some kind of clarity that I don't need to worry about how others are reading the Gita and what others are using it, how I need to, in a sense, my own relationship with it as a philosophical text. So maybe that's what I would answer to your question about how do I see it. So the tension is still there, but I don't see the tension as a problem. I see the tension as a source of, renewal, new way of reading. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's what I was trying to get at with picking that word meaning out that you said, and how sitting with the tension, but also cultivating a different kind of attention, which is a big part of your work too. You can do what you just did, and you can see this text as as depending on what point we're coming to it, and depending on what we've put our attention on coming to it, we can read it differently. And
Yes.
that within itself, like learning that happens,
Yes.
is what I'm trying to think about with the constellating and even that tension that's carrying, because right now we often just think there's two sides, and
Yes.
so we have to prove one another wrong, and we get nowhere really. So there's something in this, and I have to say I agree with you. I tried to read this when I was 17 or 18, in a kind of spiritual moment, and it just I felt really hurt by it in a way. Like I felt like Arjuna a bit at the beginning. Like I can't deal with this. I can't hear this. And now that I'm older and not really wiser, but I've been through a lot more, it's reading very differently for me, right? And it has to do with exactly what you were demonstrating, what I'm trying to talk about, where we do start to find meaning if we can allow what seem like opposites to constellate. That's kind of my way of saying it. And I feel like this text, through the conversational nature, but also through the historical and the
Yeah.
situated nature, which you bring out a lot, is a way into that. But I do think we have to talk about attention a little bit,
Yeah.
because without that, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And we won't go into all kinds of theories of consciousness and everything, because that is another important part of all this in your work too. But I do think that you've thought about consciousness from an empirical perspective, or you can say it better, that brings attention into this discussion in a way that I feel is important. Um, I don't know what you might want to say about that, but relative to kind of, well, would you like to say anything about attention? Just ATTENTION, not tension, and how that, what that's meant for you relative to this text?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, when you come to Gita, typically people often will say, "Oh, action without attachment, action without attachment," and actually that was where in the classroom often, students would ask me very, very good question. They would say, attention without attachment, isn't that kind of like indifferent, not caring? How can that be good? How can that be? And I would say, you are absolutely right. And, I would be asking, and then it emerged to me that it's really about action without attachment is about how you do it, right? It's the where you put your attention. So when Krishna is asking Arjuna to be a yogi, right? Krishna is really saying, uh, you know, cultivate this kind of redirection of your attention. So, in a way, typically speaking, when we act for a particular outcome, then our attention is on making that possible, right? That outcome comes, and that outcome, we work towards it. That's what we effort is what. Okay, so what does it mean if I don't if I'm not attached to that outcome, right? Is it that I am actually, in a way, redirecting my attention to what the nature of the world is? And it's not just me, but who I am, of course, according to Krishna. What's my relationship to everybody else? And what my relation to Krishna in the Gita, of course. So then this kind of becoming a yogi, the whole project then becomes redirecting one's attention. So I think, attention is one of the maybe, and then I have argued that consciousness is the location where that redirection happens, right? Awareness is where you can be aware. So I want to argue, I have argued, and maybe I need to argue it better, is that it's not that mind or that our actions or being in the world, suddenly we are not, it's losing its intentionality. It's still about our actions are, I'm still talking to you, right? So there is a certain amount of intentionality there. It's the aboutness. However, though, redirecting of attention will be even where I am talking to you, I'm talking to you with that kind of course, Gita says something. For me, the way I translate it is where I'm really enjoying this conversation is because this kind of conversational, dynamic, constellatory, open, receptive kind of a uh, conversation. Sometimes people actually say deep listening, right? But it's a kind of a conversation where your attention is not simply focused on the end result, but it is focused actually on the process, but also on certain ontological. for Krishna.
That reminds me of what we were trying to get at when we were talking about the self, or the
Yes.
difference between what is often thought of as a dualism, and what I was trying to say with the yoga part, feeling into that connection. There's a different kind of attention that happens when you feel into self that's not limited in any way, that actually
Yes.
doesn't deal in the words of limitation. Like, that doesn't make sense anymore, those contrasts, even though those still exist at the same
Yes.
time. So I think attention is kind of like the magic power in a way, and it's also what we cultivate in conversation. It's what
Yes.
we
Yes.
practice via
Yes.
conversation, certain kinds of conversation. But I think there's also we need to start wrapping up. I think there's a lot of care in this. You talk about care ethics, and I was talking earlier about caring being this kind of tension in itself. And in other work you've done, I feel this word is very present and important, and that seems also connected to attention and maybe a different kind of autonomy in the way I was trying to describe there. That's not really the way we think of it in Western philosophy, or as Westerners, or whatever. I even that word Westerner is weird, but I think you know what I mean. So how can we ease into that? I don't know if it's through, you said something what your student said, which I think is very powerful, about this seeming passive. And this is something
Yes.
I'm constantly trying to express, that when we hold contradiction, we don't become passive. We become more caring. We're actually feeling into ourselves as caring. It's almost too much, which is almost why we can't do it. So it can sound like non-attachment, for example, can sound like it's the opposite of caring. But I feel like the way you're trying to express it, or we're trying to get at here, it's actually more about caring and taking
Yes.
full responsibility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. It's definitely caring. Of course. I mean, think about love. Krishna says to Arjuna many times, because you are my friend. I know I love you. You are my dear friend. Yeah, that's why I'm, telling you this truth, or this, However, I also think that there are different. One of the, at least I have argued, and I think others have as well. One of the sort of the shelf life of the Gita, right? What is it that explains it being relevant, staying relevant of it for so long? And especially in Hinduism, where there are lots of different texts, right? So I think one of it is because there is a kind of an internal diversity. It's first of all, message, there is a simplicity of the message, but then once you understand the message, this is my take. There's, of course, there are this diversity. You can get to it different ways, right? So one of the ways that the three yogas or four yogas that people do, the yoga of action, yoga of knowledge, and then the bhakti yoga, yoga of devotion, where Krishna says that, okay, knowledge is difficult, action is also very difficult. So you don't need to worry about those things. Just act, as uh, as my devotee, like pure, um, be like a, you are acting for me, right? So there is a, I think devotion is absolutely, relationships are important. So how caring is important, and what caring might mean. I do think that there will be some differences we have to work out about, at least typically the way that in secular understanding of care ethics, because secular understanding of care ethics doesn't have the kind of role of Krishna plays, right? In Gita, Krishna is the Brahman. He is the ultimate. We don't have that. So there will be some ontological difference we have to be careful about and all. But I think though, overall, the importance of relationship and importance of holding different things, and also you see a kind of non-idealism. Right? We don't live in ideal real world. The world is, I think that, in feminist theory now, non-idealism, in other areas as well, non-ideal theory is kind of an important theory. And I think in a way, Gita could go along with it, at least the way that I read it, because life is not ideal. Because if it were ideal, Arjuna doesn't need to have to be killing his own people, right? I mean, that's not ideal. But that being said, how does one act with the hand one is given, right? So we are back to that thing about authenticity, thing about acceptance also, right? Thing about yeah, so I would say that there's a deep caring, and relation importance of relationships are of course all through the Mahabharata, but definitely in the Gita as well.
Yeah, I think that's part of that constellatory thing. But also, I was thinking of intersectionality or lots of other ways that feminists have come at that same idea that actually would fit really, well from a different angle. And also, I was thinking, is it in your paper maybe where you address the idea that sort of what your students had raised, but that when we go inward, we become less socially responsible. But I think you're saying, actually, that's that yogi way of attention, where
Yes,
because that's still taking the self as in some kind of inner space, and the self is
yes,
actually a dissolving of what that would be. And so
yes,
then the responsibility actually widens, and so does the circle of care.
yes,
So I think that's a very interesting
yes.
shift. Isn't that in your paper that you say
Yes,
that?
yes. And I was actually responding to one of the reviewers had
Oh,
said,
that's what it was. Okay.
uh, and you are absolutely right. It's the circle of care. Because that's why I think for me, those verses where, of course, love your friends, but also love your enemies, foes, and be not impacted so much by success or failure, and those are things that are very hard to do. But if one tries to do, what does that mean, right? What
Mhm.
kind of cognitive shift does that require, right? And I think the Gita would say that yes, and Gita actually many places it does talk about, it's not just about knowing that, right? It's not just about filling your head with certain beliefs and all that. That's okay, good, but you have to practice it, and you have that's like cultivation, the that realization, right? That's important. But it's also important is acting with that kind of holding everything, all of it, like with that kind of, I love it, how you say expanding circle of care.
Mhm. Well, it feels like that. I mean, I think this is going too far for you probably, but there's a way we could think of this as a love story, even if we thought of it in terms of coming into loving more of our enemies or of the world or of the difficult parts of ourselves or of what we're supposed to do. Or even I'm thinking about where you started with showing me that you're so interested in so many different kinds of philosophy. That kind of curiosity, letting that constellation be. For me, I would say this could be a kind of love story, but I don't know, just to end like that word love, if we can, what you would say relative to that idea, or if you have anything at all that you might want to say relative to love in
I
relation.
think, yeah, lovely. I think I would call it a love story, um, not maybe in love story in the Eric Siegel way of love story
No,
or something.
not a Hollywood
Nothing,
love story.
nothing against that, but the love story, if love meant caring, deeply caring, and where actually also means a kind of vulnerability, right? And here I find, because loving is actually giving a part of yourself, and the kind of opening, vulnerability. Here, actually, I think, of course, Arjuna's vulnerability we see. But in a way, maybe we could also say Krishna's vulnerability, because Krishna is not saying to Arjuna, you need to do this. Because at the end, he is saying that, well, do what you think is the right thing to do. Right? So it's a kind of this making that conversation. Conversation requires a kind of vulnerability, a kind of growing together, right? So yeah, I would say, yeah, it's a love story, one could say.
I hadn't thought of that before, of how conversation is a sort of caring, actually.
Yeah.
A real conversation. And that actually is very beautiful and a nice way to kind of end too, as we sort of started with that. So I just want to say thank you for your work and for, taking up the offer to do the translation and teach, and also for, talking with me today. I've really, really enjoyed this, and I really appreciate your work a lot.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I really super loved this conversation, and the time kind of flew. So that's a good sign for me. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to have this opportunity.
Well, it's an honor. Thanks for spending a little more time than we had said we were going to do too. I'll let you go now finally, but I hope we can talk again someday.
Surely, surely.
Okay.
Bye.
Be well. Bye. Hey everyone. Here's a little excerpt from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 47. It's pretty famous, frequently quoted one. I wish I could say it in the Sanskrit, but it's spoken by Krishna to the warrior Arjuna, and it's capturing this, well, not capturing, but it's about your duty, your dharma. It's just been helpful for me today, so I'll just give it to you. You have a right to do your duty, but not to the results of your work. Do not think you are the cause of the results, and do not try to avoid your duty. All right, bye.